Did Ferrari betray Hamilton in Baku? Why did they order 7-time world champion to let their teammate pass? What his engineer revealed later can completely change your perception of this moment. Baku, one of the most treacherous tracks in the calendar. Eternal lines that test the maximum power of the engine, closed curves such as strategic traps, walls that do not forgive the smallest error, and a natural tendency to generate drama. In this context, what happened there was much more than a simple equipment order. It was a raw radiography of the exact moment in which it is defined whether a team is able to think like a block or remains a set of individualities. The race advanced with a tense rhythm. The temperature conditions were higher than expected, which complicated the management of tires, especially the average compounds. Hamilton, who had achieved a solid position after a clean exit, began to lose adhesion in the low-speed curves. From boxes, Riccardo Adami, his career engineer, informed him that the rhythm was falling below the target plan for that stint. But it wasn't just a rhythm problem, it was a context problem. Just behind, Charles Leclerc came in an alternative strategy, with a cooler compound, rising return times, and a perfect window to attack. Ferrari, with a much more methodical approach than in previous seasons, made the decision. Not by preference, not because of internal hierarchy, but because the career algorithm, where analysis and posterior traffic prediction indicated that the movement was logical. Adami, in direct communication with Lewis, transmitted the order, let Leclerc. At that moment, millions of eyes worldwide interpreted what they wanted to see. Some saw an act of submission, others a betrayal. But what really happened was an exercise of tactical rationality and, more importantly, a silent leadership sample. Hamilton did not oppose. He did not question. He did not ask. He simply accepted the order and facilitated overtaking in a line without unnecessary resistance. He did it calmly, with professionalism, and with the full awareness that his career would not win in that return, even in that Grand Prix. In internal radios, which were not transmitted to the public, Adami expanded the technical explanation. Leclerc had 3 more laps of useful life in the tires. Its energy consumption in the ERS was better managed, and the final strategy depended on one of the 2 pilots managed to attack the McLaren and Mercedes group in front. Hamilton didn't have that window. Leclerc, yes. It was a logical, mathematical, almost surgical play. When the checkered flag fell in Baku, the final order seemed to freeze in time a race that had promised more than he delivered in results for Ferrari. Lewis Hamilton crossed the goal in the 8th position, followed by Charles Leclerc in the 9th. From a numerical perspective, it was a discreet loot. Just a few points for a team that aspired to something much more ambitious. But as is usually the case in Formula One, what is seen in the results table rarely tells the whole story. The difference between the two was minimal. Just a few tenths of a second separated Hamilton from Leclerc in the arrival line. But those tenths, in this case, were more symbolic than sports. The order to return the position to Leclerc had been broadcast, but too late. Hamilton tried, raised his foot, reduced his speed, but there was no enough space to fulfill it in a clean way without compromising the security or integrity of the race. And he crossed first. By default, not by intention. For tactical uncoordination, not by disobedience. This outcome generated a mixed reaction in both the media and within the paddock. Some interpreted it as a communication error. Others, such as a failure in the execution of an already too complicated strategy for the last turns. But within the team, the consequence was clearer. The need to review, in detail, how decisions are structured at critical moments. Because it was not simply a poorly executed order. It was the reflection of an imperfect synchronization that can cost much more in more closed championship contexts. The most interesting thing happened outside the spotlights. In private conversations between engineers and pilots, in post-carrier meetings where each sector is analyzed, each radio sector, each data crossing. There, Ferrari acknowledged that the decision to exchange positions was again correct in principle, but poorly calculated in time and form. Responsibility was assumed without drama. Lines were drawn to prevent it from happening again. And that even if it is not seen in the headlines, can be a key seed in the evolution of the equipment as a competitive structure. For Hamilton, however, the 8th position had a hidden value. It was not only the result that mattered, but what was built from that outcome. On the one hand, it was clear that his level of commitment to team orders is genuine, even when the conditions to execute them are not ideal. On the other, he reinforced his personal narrative as a pilot that puts the team above the ego, even if that means accepting misunderstandings that then become media ammunition. For Leclerc, the outcome was more frustrating. He had fulfilled his part by letting Hamilton pass in the first instance in an attempt to maximize the rhythm with cooler tires. Not to recover the position could have been interpreted as an injustice. But even in his subsequent statements, the tone was more resigned than aggressive. There were no public complaints. Only the acceptance that in a race where nothing was completely fluid, the result was a faithful reflection of a team that is still calibrating its processes in real time. At the championship level, the added points did not change the global balance, but they did add extra pressure. Because while Ferrari added modestly, Red Bull consolidated a perfect victory with Max Verstappen, and McLaren continued to accumulate solidity with both cars. Each discrete result begins to weigh when it accumulates, and the championship does not wait for the internal structures to align. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of closing in Baku. No matter how strong the driver's alignment is, how promising the technical package is, or how clear a paper strategy seems, if the execution is not surgical, if the communication is not perfect, the final result will be just an echo of what it could have been. For Ferrari, it was a soft warning. For Hamilton, a test surpassed in silence. For Leclerc, a bitter lesson. And for the championship, a clear sign that there is still much to resolve in the struggle for consistency. But the most revealing came later, out of the car. In the statements to the press, while social networks burned with accusations of favoritism and betrayal, Hamilton adopted a serene, even pedagogical tone. He did not deny his disappointment, but put it in context. He explained that he had understood the decision. That, in effect, Leclerc had more rhythm. It was not worth fighting for a position that could cost the team in the global time. And that he, as a Ferrari pilot, had not come alone to win races, but to build something bigger. This episode was not an isolated anecdote. It was an identity test for the new Ferrari. Because for the first time in many years, the Scuderia acted as one voice. He was not a pilot managing his solo career. It was a complete structure from the pit wall to the steering wheel, making a joint decision. And in the center of that decision, a more mature Lewis Hamilton, more focused, and perhaps more dangerous than ever. This does not mean that Hamilton has given prominence. On the contrary, it means that it has raised its role. Because true leadership in Formula One is not measured only in advances or poles. It is measured by the ability to influence, to sustain the structure at times of tension, and to understand that war is not won by fighting all battles. He wins by choosing well when to give in and when to attack. And Hamilton, in Baku, chose to yield. But not for weakness. He did it because he knows that the season is long, and that the opportunity to return the blow will arrive. And when I arrive, he will do it with all the strength of someone who has been building, not fighting only for himself, but for a whole team. When the race ended, while the media were looking for explosive reactions, gestures of rage or frustration, Hamilton did not fall into the trap. His position was controlled, almost pedagogical. He assured that he understood the strategic context, that the order to let Leclerc were not a humiliation, but a technical decision based on data. He said calmly that the important thing was to add points for Ferrari, and that he himself had evaluated that his rhythm was not the ideal in that phase of the race. But you have to read between the lines. Hamilton was not simply accepting. I was sending a message. It is not here to feed egos or to feed dramas. He is here to win championships. And that requires long-term vision. After all, this is not Lewis Hamilton himself 10 years ago. You no longer need to demonstrate anything with forced overtaking or with lit statements. Your record speaks for itself. 7 world titles, more than 100 victories, and one of the most complete trajectories in the history of sport. What he is looking for now is something more complex, being the architect of a transformation within Ferrari. Convert to the Scuderia, again, a team capable of dominating on its own merit. And his answer in Baku is proof of that change. Because at other times, perhaps in its early years in McLaren, or in the most emotional stages in Mercedes, such a movement could have triggered an internal war. But this time, there was no confrontation. Only analysis. Only vision. Only strategy. That maturity does not mean passivity. In fact, it is probably the biggest pressure act that a pilot can exert. Because not reacting negatively, Hamilton forces the team to assume their responsibility. He puts them in front of the mirror. He tells them, I am here to play as a team. Now show that the team is prepared to play to win. The Baku Grand Prix will remain in memory not by a melee battle or for an impossible advance, but for what was not seen with the naked eye. For a decision made in silence. For strategic obedience that, far from being submission, revealed a superior sports intelligence. and by a pilot who, instead of demanding prominence in a curve, chose to build it in the shadow. And now that you know the real context, strategic reasons, and implicit message in everything that happened in Baku, what do you think of all this? What would you have done instead? Do you think that Ferrari has really learned from his mistakes of the past, or this is just a mirage before returning to strategic chaos? And what do you think of Hamilton at this stage? Is this its most complete, more dangerous version? Or do you see it in the final phase of your career? Thank you for accompanying me until the end. Let me know your opinion in the comments, and if you are not signed to this channel, signed.